Yale Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Quadcast, a Yale Divinity School podcast series featuring expert insight on contemporary religious and political issues. In response to the coronavirus pandemic, we decided to air this episode a month ahead of schedule as it talks about finding joy in a time of suffering and could be of help to our listeners during this time. In this episode, Yale alum Emily Judd interviews Yale Divinity School professor Mary Clark Moschella about her research on joy. Professor Moschella talks about finding one's life purpose.
It's important to recognize one's gifts, the things one loves to do, and also the world's needs and see where they intersect.
She describes the biological obstacles we face in pursuing a joyful life.
It's easy for us to remember the negative things, and there's even the brain research says we have a negativity bias.
And Professor Moschella gives practical tips for reframing our outlook to focus on the good.
If we learn to pay attention, to the good things that may seem small, but, really just, for example, having a friend that you love and that loves you, that's not a small thing. That's a big thing.
Welcome, Professor Moschella, to the podcast today.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Now, you received a Henry Luce Fellowship in Theology to study joy. How do you define joy, and why is it important to study?
So I look at joy as an emotion, and I also feel a gift of God, and it's something we don't want to miss in this life. And so it's important to cultivate the capacity to recognize, opportunities for joy and wonder in our lives. But more than a focus on joy as an emotion, my second definition has to do with joy more as a spiritual path. So kind of an orientation to life where we are attentive to God's goodness, love, and presence with us.
So in applying your research, can you suggest some practices to nurture and maintain a sense of joy in our daily lives?
Well, yes. I think one of the things I learned is that the emotion of joy is often experienced together with two other emotions, and they are interest and wonder. And so I think that whether as caregivers or others, if we find the things that really interest us and allow us a sense of wonder, we will be more able to lean into that kind of spiritual path of joy. And I think, particularly for religious leaders, it's important to find, recognize one's gifts, the things one loves to do, and also the world's needs and see where they intersect. And so live into that. Also to realize that though we will not necessarily fix all the great problems of the world, that we can be a part of changing things that we think are wrong and contribute something along the way.
What is the relationship between joy and gratitude? Did you find any relationship in your research? One thing that I have heard many people say, including Oprah, is there's something to be said for writing a list of 10 things that you're grateful for every day, and that can give someone a profound sense of joy. Did you find anything with that relationship?
I read lots of books about that, and yes, I think there is a connection. I think, there is an old hymn that was called Count Your Blessings, count them one by one, see what God has done. And I do think that could be translated into, in a pastoral setting, encouraging people to take time to reflect on the goodness and blessings in their lives. Yes. And I think certainly the daily practice, I actually did the practice myself, and I think it is more uplifting than you might think. Some days it may be hard to say, like, okay, what are two things I'm thankful for today? And yet when people take the time to think about it, there is kind of a change in orientation. And I think what happens is it's easy for us to remember the negative things. And there's even, the brain research says we have a negativity bias. So if
So
something
we're all kind of
difficult,
pessimists?
yeah, if something difficult happens, that sticks in our minds in a stronger way. And so it takes almost like 5 good things to counter one difficult experience, right? So, but if we learn to pay attention, to the good things that may seem small, but, really just, for example, having a friend that you love and that loves you, that's not a small thing. That's a big thing. So taking a moment to remember that and even to connect with that friend can really change our outlook on the world. And as I said, it gives us resilience and therefore the power to do more.
You actually posed this question in a previous YDS article. You asked, how can we be joyful when we know about the suffering that exists in the world? How would you answer that question?
I don't think, for one thing, that we need to be joyful every minute. And I don't think the pastoral task is to try to cheer people up. So it's important to say that. But on the other side, I don't think we can do this work for any length of time if we don't have a wellspring of joy, well-being, goodness, connection to God and each other that feeds us and that makes us resilient and, capable of connecting with people in their moments of despair or sadness, but not necessarily taking that on ourselves and carrying it around so that, every single situation weighs us down. So I guess for me, it became important to realize that religious leaders becoming miserable does not really help change the world. If we want to change the world and work for goodness and grace, then we need a certain amount of resilience and personal well-being. So the tips would be to take care of oneself, to get a decent night's sleep when possible, to exercise, to move, to think about nutrition and stress reduction when possible, and to, embrace the moments of goodness and grace when they do come along.
So you teach a course on pastoral care at YDS, and I struggle with anxiety. And one of the most frustrating things I've heard when I shared about my anxiety to a church leader was his advice to just pray the anxiety away. Should church leaders give advice on medical and psychological issues as well as the spiritual?
Well, I teach a course on psychopathology and pastoral care, and I do think it's very important for religious leaders to understand what psychiatric illness is, to be able to recognize when people are, exhibiting symptoms. And I think it's important to know when to make referrals to medical providers when we recognize symptoms or when someone, appears depressed or is becoming suicidal or whatever they might present. When we recognize that there's a problem, to make referrals and, when possible, to work in tandem with medical professionals. And this does not mean saying, go see this doctor, I can't help you anymore. I do believe that persons struggling with a mental illness do indeed need and deserve pastoral care in the sense of accompaniment and recognizing that, we're all on a spiritual journey. We all have to come to terms with our limitations as human beings. And there is wisdom to be found when someone grapples with an illness and what is often a difficult struggle to get help, get the right help, and whether that be through medication and or talk therapies or other kinds of therapies. In addition to that, having a spiritual community in which one can be open and share one's struggles is very important. And so I think pastors ought to understand mental illness, maybe teach courses on it, and then that kind of cues their people in so that they realize this is someone I could talk to. Yeah, so I think it's very important.
Before coming to YDS in 2010, you served as a church pastor for the United Church of Christ for 13 years. What were some challenges that you experienced in transitioning from church leader to academic professor, from preaching to teaching?
From preaching to teaching. Well, my first class at Wesley Theological Seminary was quite challenging. There were a lot of attorneys there who were students, and I thought, oh, they're going to sue me if they don't get the grades they want. And so there were definitely some challenges, but I guess for me it was also a great joy because I love reading and researching to kind of have a kind of like a second career in which there were connections between what I used to do and what I do now. And I still feel that in some ways, the greatest wisdom that I have to impart about pastoral care comes from my experience in the church, where I really, was up against it. And sometimes I felt out of my depth. So going back to school helped me understand my work in the parish better. And hopefully, enables me to give students the kind of insight they need moving into pastoral situations.
So you teach a course at Yale Divinity School titled Pastoral Wisdom in Fiction, Memoir, and Drama. This year, the class brought together Yale students and incarcerated women at a prison in Danbury, Connecticut. How did that partnership come about?
Well, I've been interested in the topic of mass incarceration for many years. And a few years ago, during my sabbatical, I took a course offered by the Inside Out Prison Exchange Program at Temple University. And I trained in teaching Inside Out classes, and that's what we call this model. So we have insiders and we have outsiders. The insiders are the incarcerated persons, and the outsiders are the YDS students. And so I trained at Graterford State Prison. And that's just outside of Philadelphia. It's a high-security men's prison. And my teachers there were the insiders who had taken many courses, many inside-out courses. And there's a kind of pedagogy that goes with this training that encourages face-to-face conversations between insiders and outsiders, and a kind of searching approach to knowledge so that people are not just taking in lectures or a lot of material, but they're thinking about it, processing it, and exchanging their ideas, say, about the reading with each other.
So considering that students living at Yale and women living in a prison system come to a classroom with different perspectives, drastically different daily lives and schedules, how did you bridge these gaps?
Well, we did some interactive exercises to kind of get to know you, some of which I learned from my training. And I think the thing that really helped was our conversation each week focused on a different book. So everyone read a book and wrote a paper every week. The insiders had to handwrite their papers, which they did very diligently.
They don't have access to computer technology?
No,
Wow.
They're not allowed to go on the internet. A couple of them had access to typewriters, but they weren't very good. So they're really limited. They can't do online research. So all of the teaching had to happen pretty much in the class, or it was based on the reading. And YDS, graciously, our deans, Sterling and Hurt, helped provide the books for the insiders. So they read their books and wrote their papers, and so the topic of conversation was there for us each week, and that's how we kind of came together. And the papers were reflective, so people wrote about how they saw themselves in the literature or how they could relate to it. And gradually, people told their stories, both insiders and outsiders, through that process.
Was there any specific moment that you experienced during teaching this class, or a moment that you witnessed during the class that really had a profound impact on you?
Well, there were many. For example, the first book we read was Maya Angelou's story in I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And of course, the incarcerated women also know something about being caged. And they could also relate to Maya Angelou's story, many of them, of experiencing trauma at an early age. And one wonderful moment came when one of our outside students, who is a clinician and kind of an expert in trauma care, shared some of her understanding of brain science and what happens to someone when they're traumatized at an early age and how it changes them and kind of limits their choices in certain ways, at least for a time, until they process and, come to terms with what happened to them. And one of our students spoke at the closing ceremony we held a couple of weeks ago, and asked the outside student to repeat what she had said. And she talked about how much it helped me to understand my brain and how it freed me, to go forward. So that was an example of one, such moment.
Well, Professor Moschella, thank you so much for joining us today on the Quadcast.
You're welcome. It's been a
was
pleasure.
Joyous.